Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Tuesday evening, so close to Memorial Day. This summer, I can't believe it. It's already here. So we're thrilled to have you with us tonight. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Rachel Narwald. I'm the nurse practitioner with Preventive Cardiology. Many of you know my attending physician, Dr. Gianos. And we have really worked hard to really keep great content going for this lecture series. As many of you know, we used to do this in person. COVID happened. We do these all recorded now. So I do want to mention that these lectures are recorded as of September. We've been recording our monthly talks, and they are all available for free at any time on our YouTube channel, which is Doc Heart Health. So Doc like DOC like doctor, and we'll also put that in the Q&A section for you all to see. So please feel free to join other talks, tell your friends about the lecture tonight if they couldn't make it, and you can always watch these at a later date. So we are so fortunate tonight to have Dr. Jamie Kane with us. He is the director of the Center for Weight Management at Northwell Health, and he is also the chief of obesity medicine. So he's going to be speaking, to us about a lot of things this evening, but basically he's going to touch on the physiologic nature of obesity, some of the causes of obesity, beyond just simple calorie balance, and also address some strategies that we can use to target some of those causes. So I don't want to hold up too much time. I do want to let all the participants know, please at any time enter any questions you have into the Q&A section. We are going to be having at least 10 to 15 minute time for question at the end of the talk. So anytime you think of them, pop them into that Q&A, and I'll make sure to keep track to pose all of the pertinent questions to Dr. Kane. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we're thrilled to learn from you tonight.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Let me share my screen. Um, Hopefully we'll be able to get underway. Okay, I think we're good. So yeah, thanks for having me. The history of dieting in America is pretty interesting. A lot of money is being made off of dieting, and the majority of Americans at some point in their adult life, usually multiple times, will be on some sort of diet. And yet, if you take all diets and throw medications in there too, people who've lost weight are extremely likely to regain that weight within 1 to 3 years. The number is actually pretty staggering. Anywhere between, let's say, 90 and 99%, depending on the study you look at it, people are going to regain the weight. So let's just assume that the way it's been done for a long time doesn't make sense. Um, so what I'd like to do is start by going through the complex physiologic nature of obesity. It's not going to be a full science class; it'll be a science class light. But I think to understand kind of some of the requirements for obesity are important for us to understand, so that we can understand what goes wrong when we're trying to lose weight and keep weight off. And then I hope to end by addressing some strategies that will allow us to target these causes beyond keeping the calorie count down. So obesity in America is out of control. Is that the best way to say it? We call it an epidemic, although it's really soon going to be just a pandemic around the world as we export our way of life. If you go back to the 1970s compared to now, the numbers are absolutely staggering. But even if you look at the 1990s and then 2000 and 2015, we see this kind of exponential growth of obesity. Whereas even in 2000, which most of us who are over the age of 20 would think of as the modern times, no state had over 26% of the population, adult population, with obesity. And by even 2015, and it's gotten a little bit worse, almost every state was over 26%, right? And in fact, if you look back at 2000, most states were under 18%, right? So if you combine overweight, obesity, which would be the next level up, and then a condition we call normal weight obesity, which is the metabolic complications of obesity, but maybe the weight criteria doesn't meet it. But functionally, the people with these weight-related issues, over 70% of America now has these issues. So we can consider that the new norm. So what is obesity? Um, you're going to hear most of the time when people talk about uh, stratifying what's normal versus overweight versus obesity. It's a body mass index, which is simply a basic formula involving a ratio with weight and height. It is not the world's best measurement for determining how severe obesity really is. But if you hear the term obesity, we think a body mass index over 30, and then morbid obesity over 35, and that's when we're really starting to see a lot of people with a lot of the health complications. Um, Probably a better marker than this is going to be waist circumference, how big the waist is, or a waist to hip ratio. Basically, being that we know that the fat inside the midsection is the most metabolically dangerous. Right, so the complications are every single organ system. There's not an organ system that's spared by obesity, and at some point we thought that some things happen to coincide, or maybe, for instance, like osteoarthritis, maybe it's because we weigh too much and it puts a lot of pressure on our ankles or knees. But it turns out that even fingers are affected by obesity. So it turns out that, and this is a theme I'm going to go back over later, but that every organ system kind of crosstalks with every other organ system by some central mechanisms that seem to be deranged when we're talking about obesity. And why do we really care? Yeah, there's a lot of disease burden, but quite frankly, the old data tends to hold up of a J-shaped curve, meaning at extremely low weights, people are more likely to die. But as you see, the curve at a body mass index of 25, just overweight, we start seeing increased rates of mortality. There's certain conditions during which being slightly overweight might be protective, but for overall health, the answer would be we're aiming for that normal BMI range. So what causes obesity? There's a confluence. These are called Venn diagrams. I like making Venn diagrams, but where we see the confluence of our genetics combined with the environment that we live in, mixed with our own kind of personal behavior choices, and usually two or all of them are going to be implicated in causing obesity. And it's not to say that because I mentioned behavioral choices that this is necessarily our fault. We are, when I was at training at Yale, there was Professor David Katz there who gave a wonderful analogy of our tendency towards obesity being like the polar bear in the desert, this perfectly evolved animal that can handle harsh weathers of extreme cold. Underneath the camouflage, thick, white, warm fur, they have a thick, non-porous, black, tarry skin that absorbs all the heat. It doesn't let it out. And that makes perfect sense. They can stay warm. They can camouflage from their prey and manage all types of weather. But you stick that same polar bear in the desert, and those same evolutionary mechanisms that kept it alive and thriving will kill it. Right. So it won't be easy to find food here. It sticks out like a polar bear in a desert. And the ability to absorb and retain heat will actually eventually kill it, right? So I said I'm going to go beyond caloric restriction, but let's just talk about why we care at all. What's a calorie, right? It's a unit of energy. So if you think of the calorie balance, which is, I'm not saying it's not important, I'm just saying there's more to it than that. The taking in, we eat and we absorb calories, and then we expend calories through what we call our resting metabolism, and then our active metabolism, the things we do voluntarily, right? So, as we're laying in bed, that's kind of our resting metabolism. But if we walk, if we do stuff, if we chew, we burn extra calories. About 3,500 calories is worth about a pound of fat. It never seems to work out exactly like that. But if we think about, an excess of calories of 3,500 calories, which would mean when one's trying to lose weight, if they can create a deficit where they're burning 500 calories more per day, over 1 week, that'll be about a pound of loss. And just looking at the types of foods. I've actually testified to the USDA about the 2020 nutrition guidelines, asking people not to get obsessed about macronutrients like fat and carbohydrates and protein because they're all different. But just to give you a sense, fat has the most energy of all per unit weight, whereas carbohydrates and protein have less. And in fact, a lot of the carbohydrates that I would recommend that you eat have practically no net energy. All right, so given this calorie theory, it's pretty simple, right? I mean, in 1970, the average American ate 2,168 calories. And by 2008, or this is still 13 years ago, the average American ate more than 20% more, right? So if you're taking in 500 calories more per day and we're otherwise all the same, right? That's worth 50 pounds a year of weight gain. So that makes sense. If we increased our portion sizes and we increased the fat that we take in and the sugar that we take in, and it makes perfect sense that we're too big. So then we have the solution, right? We eat less, we exercise more, and that should work, and it does for a while. But then we get the rebound, right? So why doesn't this form of dieting alone work? One is evolution. So we talked about the polar bear in the desert. Well, here's the human version of that. We evolved in a state where our death came from starvation and infection and getting killed by animals, probably mainly humans, because that's who kills most people. And our evolutionary drive was to be able to withstand famine and withstand bad weather and withstand, running away from whoever's coming after us. So it made sense then that as we lost weight, as our fat goes down, some hormones like leptin and ghrelin, and we don't have to know all the details of them, but think of leptin as a hormone that kind of keeps our metabolism up and our appetite down, and ghrelin is another hormone along those lines that makes our appetite go up and our fat storage go up. And so those normally would be kind of in balance, but if our body senses we're starving, our leptin levels come crashing down. So it slows down our metabolism, allowing us to do more work without burning as many calories and go out and find food. And the ghrelin levels will go sky high, which will incentivize us to eat and store as much fat as we can. There were no states where we would weigh 300 pounds and die of complications of diabetes. And so, we kind of evolved before we were able to get that food excess that allows us to get there. Along those lines, and this term sounds really offensive, but it is, adaptive thermogenesis. What that means is as we lose weight, our metabolism slows down, and that makes sense. If we, let's say, lose 10% of our weight from 200 pounds to 180 pounds, you would think, okay, well, let's say our resting metabolic rate was we could take in 2,000 calories and not gain weight. You would think, all right, well, if I lose 10% of my weight, I should drop my metabolic rate 10%. But it turns out once you've gotten to a peak, when you drop 10% of your body weight, on average, your metabolism will drop 20%, not 10%. And that extra 10% there is this adaptive thermogenesis. It's our body saying you're starving to death. So the bottom line here is that the most amount of fat we've ever had is considered normal for us. There's no like I have a set point, I weighed 150 my whole life. Once you hit 200, 200's the set point, give or take, but basically based on the amount of fat we had. And why is that so hard? Because in modern life, if our metabolism slows down, we have all the comforts where we can drive to get our food and drive to work and sit in front of a TV and get our entertainment, then we don't need to burn any calories. And yet for 24/7, we have addictive food exposed to us. So that combination really seems to have gotten in the way. And so you would think, given all the excess calories that have been presented to us in the last 40, 50 years, and our evolutionary tendency to want to pack on this weight, it seems to make sense that how we've gotten where we are. And food can act like a drug, right? So our brains treat certain foods, sugar is a big one, certain types of fat. In fact, certain ratios of sugar, fat, and salt are known to be particularly addictive, and the food industry knows that. So, if you design a new soda flavor, you can make over $1 million per flavor that you design. And we know that there are scientists more than chefs working on your kind of commercial food industry. and food is always made to be more addictive. And it's a long conversation, but just understand the more processed it is, the more addictive someone has made it. And the idea is not to make you sick; the idea is to make you want more, which we tend to oblige. And part of that comes from this. We have drive centers and reward centers that are the same whether we're eating, whether we're taking cocaine, whether we're drinking alcohol, whether in any form of addiction. And so once the drive center is activated, meaning I want, it's very hard to shut that off. So one thing we're going to want to do is stay away from the addictive nature of food. All right. So if it's more than just calories, if this just cutting back calories is going to backfire in the long run, what do we do? We got to think about what are other things that seem to be associated, right? And it turns out that a good saying that I heard a few years ago was that calories in versus calories out matters, but what happens in between, there's a giant gray zone with all sorts of other stuff going on. And I'd like to focus on three main areas. So one is insulin. And I'll go into what insulin is, but insulin resistance or excess insulin is the net result of that, seems to be a requirement for obesity. So is inflammation. And it turns out that, in the last 15 years, it's slowly being pieced together that our gut microbes, and there's over 100 trillion of them, seem to be intimately involved. So that's another piece I'm going to talk about. And then circadian rhythm disruption. So we have a 24-hour cycle. The modern world has allowed us to live outside of that 24-hour cycle, and that seems to be particularly harmful for us. So I'll talk about those three things, and you see my Venn diagram again, and how they kind of all interact for the perfect storm of creating obesity. And the way we work is that we try to respect not just the calorie balance, but all these other issues so that the infrastructure that leads towards obesity gets reversed and not just, short-term calorie drops and fixes. So I'll start by talking about the insulin resistance. So what is insulin and how does it work? Okay, so, many people might think of insulin as something that's for people with diabetes, but actually the insulin is not sufficient in people with diabetes, but the reality is we all live off of insulin all the time. It has many actions. But let's think of its most important action as we eat, our food gets absorbed, raising our blood glucose levels. And when the blood glucose levels go up, the pancreas releases insulin, this hormone, which is the key that allows glucose to be taken up into cells. The types of cells that they get taken up into are going to be, let's say, muscle cells, liver, and then fat-containing sacs we call adipocytes, or basically the sacs that allow fat to accumulate under normal circumstances. Those are adipocytes. Those where insulin tends to act, right? And so what happens is if you see the insulin will fit right into this insulin receptor beautifully, like a lock and key, and that'll cause a cascade of chemical reactions, like one after another, that allows these channels to open, and these transport, basically, like think of it as a shuttle, will come grab the glucose and allow it to go inside the cell. It's not a particularly efficient process, but this is the normal process by which we live. And if things are going well, and we're in this what we call homeostasis, we will have well-controlled blood sugars, and our insulin levels will be, insulin use will be efficient, so we can live on minimal insulin, and our glucose and our insulin are controlled, and we store fat when we need it, but not too much. And we store excess sugar inside our muscles, and then when we go run, because we're very active, we take up the blood sugar and everything works. We break down the blood sugar and we use it in our bloodstream. Okay, that's fine, but that's not how most Americans actually function, because we live in this state of insulin resistance. So basically, insulin resistance, you eat, your glucose levels go up, your insulin tries to bind to the receptor, and your muscle cell will say, I don't know what you're talking about. So maybe the receptor, like the keyhole, is now warped in shape. Or maybe the insulin is able to bind to the keyhole, but the chemical cascade has been destroyed. So the signaling that allows the channel to open and the shuttle to come take the glucose in, that's all been destroyed, or at least blunted its effect. So what happens is glucose remains high, and then your body's response is, well, if glucose is high, we need more insulin, more insulin, more insulin. The problem with that is that high insulin is associated with all sorts of disease. Particularly, though, insulin is remember I said it has a lot of roles. one of its major roles is actually to store fat as well. So when insulin levels are high, it causes fat storage. And it turns out that they've done studies on rodents that show if you block the ability to make excess insulin, so they have just enough insulin to keep sugars under control, you cannot create obesity. You can force feed a mouse fat all day long, and it won't develop obesity. Um, and other evidence has shown that medications that reduce the insulin burden in humans tend to be associated with weight loss. So we think that this is a requirement actually for obesity. And it turns out that some elegant studies have demonstrated, at least in muscles, that the mechanism by which this insulin resistance happens. Sorry, I've changed the shape of I found a different slide here, but it is little little fat droplets inside the muscle cell are what actually cause all this damage. So they might directly warp the receptors for the insulin, but also maybe the insulin will bind, but they cause what's called inflammation and oxidative stress. You've heard of antioxidants. Well, this is the free radical damage that damages all the signaling molecules and all the different mechanisms inside the muscle. So the muscle doesn't work well and it doesn't pick up sugar effectively. All right. And that seems to be the major mechanism inside muscle. Now, inside the liver, it seems to be that you can get insulin resistance as well. And you might have heard the term fatty liver, but it turns out fatty liver is not nearly as benign as once thought. You know, even when I was training, 15, 18 years ago, we used to breathe a sigh of relief and say, oh, it's only fatty liver, and that's why your liver enzymes are high. But it turns out that fatty liver is taking over as the #1 cause of liver cancer. As the ability to treat hepatitis, infectious hepatitis gets better, it turns out that the #1 cause of liver cancer is going to be fatty liver, and that's basically an obesity and insulin resistance mediated presence of fat in the liver, which eventually causes inflammation and scarring over. And once it scars, it becomes irreversible. So, you know, when we hear that, we want to get on top of it. Now, the cause of insulin resistance, there's a genetic predisposition. People with a family history of diabetes that's extensive are more likely to have it. Excess body fat, particularly in the belly, seems to really make this worse. So the more insulin resistance you have, the more belly fat you get, the more belly fat you get, the more insulin resistance, and we're just spinning circles here. Sleep deprivation and ill timing of eating and sleeping and lifestyle seem to play a major role. Dysbiosis, I remember I talked about the gut microbes. We're going to get into that later, and the inflammation and the oxidative stress, and then diet. Right. So, what is the leading cause of all of this stuff? It's actually the consumption of saturated fat is going to be #1. So you remove saturated fat from your diet, even in the presence of some sugar. There's actually been evidence that you can reverse diabetes and insulin resistance. Saturated fat being fat that's solid at room temperature. Most saturated fat is going to come in the form of animal fat. The most concentrated version being in the form of cheese, cream, ice cream, butter, things like that. But the most voluminous amount of saturated fat comes in the form of chicken, because 9 billion chickens are slaughtered in America each year for consumption. And so in the name of health, our culture eats a lot of chicken, but it actually still has saturated fat in it. Now, in the liver, the other aspect is that we have to worry about is fructose, and that's fruit sugar. Now, I'm not saying fruit is the problem, but the sugar that comes from fruit, which is the sweet part of, say, table sugar, or the sweet part of soda, or the sweet part of fruit, actually also is kind of poisonous for the liver and causes excess fat storage. And it's that combination of excess calories plus the saturated fat and the fructose that seem to get in the way. Interestingly, fruit in and of itself seems to improve insulin resistance because the fiber and the antioxidants in that fruit seem to mitigate the damage of the fructose. So the bottom line is stay away from sweet unless you're eating whole fruit, and then do it. Okay, so next topic will be the inflammation and the what we call the dysbiosis, which is the abnormal population and function of microbes living in our intestines. So we have over 100 trillion microbes living in our intestines. Most of them are going to be living in the second half. So if you take the second half of the small intestine and the large intestine, if they creep up to the front, we tend to not feel very well. But these are extremely important. And originally they were thought to be kind of just happen to live there, part of, maybe then becomes, well, maybe it's part of evolution they happen to live there. Then it's, well, maybe it's part of your digestion, maybe it's part of your immune system. It's part of everything. So we have an I made this slide because I'm not very good graphically, and it looks like a devil star. But basically, every organ system crosstalks with each other, and it turns out that when it comes to things that affect obesity and your metabolic kind of system, everything talks. So if your nervous system is disrupted, let's say you're not sleeping and your body's under a lot of stress, it will affect your gut microbes and your ability to digest foods, and ultimately your immune system will suffer and so forth. If you disrupt your gut microbes, it affects your immune system and predisposes you to inflammation and autoimmune disease and insulin resistance and so forth. Every system's talking to each other. So how does this work with the gut microbes? Well, most simply put, those we've heard of prebiotics and probiotics, in particular probiotics. Those are not. If I look for an image to show the relationship, and everything I found was someone selling a product. So prebiotics and probiotics are not pills; they live inside us. Well, the probiotics do, right? Those are healthy, good bacteria that are living commensally inside of our intestines, that help us produce normal physiology. So at their best, they reduce inflammation, they improve insulin sensitivity, they help control appetite, they actually are shown, if they're producing good chemicals, can reverse asthma, prevent colon cancer. Basically, how you would consider normal, healthy behavior. In fact, they actually cause the release of serotonin, which makes us happy and controls our appetite. All right. Now, these probiotics are living off of prebiotics, and those are actually a type of food. So those are going to be undigestible carbohydrate material. That undigestible carbohydrate material passes through the first half of our digestive system, where they will be exposed to acid and digestive enzymes, and it turns out that these are resistant to that, right? And these prebiotics are undigestible carbohydrate material. So as soon as anyone tells you for metabolic health, you got to eat low carbohydrate, run. They're wrong. Now, that's not to say eat all carbohydrates, eat bad carbohydrates, but the healthiest foods on the planet for us, in terms of antioxidant load, in terms of fiber, in terms of prebiotics, in terms of all the things we know that improve longevity, that reverse obesity, that make us happy, that do all that stuff, are going to be in the form of carbohydrate, but they're in the form of a healthy carbohydrate. And in fact, the majority of those should be undigestible. When they pass there, they get to the second half where your microbes living, and then they ferment them, like you make wine or other fermented things. And so they make these things called short chain fatty acids. Please don't memorize that, but just understand there's a good chemical being made, and those short chain, and unfortunately the other byproduct is methane, which is gas. So a healthy diet, you will have gas, although it gets better over time. The short chain fatty acids are where all this miracle is. So they actually cause your liver to stop producing extra sugar, and they cause your pancreas to release insulin, but only when sugar is high, meaning it makes the insulin system efficient. And when the insulin system's efficient, you don't have high insulin, and thus less fat storage and less inflammation and so forth. They have pathways by which they reduce inflammation. It's the short chain fatty acids that interact with your intestinal cells that actually produce and ultimately release most of the serotonin in your body. So people might take the old-fashioned Prozac or modern medications for depression, but most of those medications are just doing a small piece in your brain to maintain serotonin around the areas of use, but most of that serotonin is being produced and stored in the gut. So if we eat healthy foods, and you'll notice people that eat healthy diets tend to be relatively happier. Now, the problem is, though, let's see if I can, so if we eat a diet that's not made up of these prebiotic foods, and those prebiotic foods, these undigestible carbohydrate material, is found in beans the most, and in fruits and vegetables and whole intact grains and nuts and seeds, right? Those are where you're going to find your most prebiotics. Yes, prebiotics exist in breast milk too, but most of us are not going to be living off that later on. And so if we're eating stuff other than that, let's say the standard American diet, which instead of consisting of that, consists of high amounts of animal protein and saturated fat and refined carbohydrates, which are more like your sugar, your flour, your white rice, and so forth. What happens is those refined carbohydrates are immediately being absorbed because they're very susceptible to the stomach acid and the digestive enzymes. So they don't get to pass through to your probiotics in the back half of your intestines. So the excess protein and fat is going to get to them. And that's going to cause a different reaction. So instead of these short chain fatty acids, we kind of get the evil twin, which are these branched short chain fatty acids, and those cause the exact opposite reaction. So instead of blocking excess sugar production and causing timely insulin release, it actually blocks all that. So you end up with high blood sugars and dysregulated insulin release. It causes the release of stress hormones instead of the happy hormone serotonin. It causes pro-inflammation. It blocks the blockade of asthma. It's more likely to be associated with colon cancer, and all the good stuff is actually in reverse. And so even if someone's on a short-term low carbohydrate diet where they're avoiding these things and they're losing a little bit of weight, mainly in the form of lean mass, but that's another issue, we're actually rotting our infrastructure so that we end up with these probiotic. The probiotics are no longer acting in a beneficial way. They're going to be making these harmful chemicals. And that is the theory behind which we have this kind of chronic inflammation and insulin resistance based on how our gut microbes are being fed. So in a setting of a high-fat feeding, it changes how this works. And what that does is, part of the mechanism of inflammation is the how your flora, how the bacteria in your intestine are living, change, and that causes your gut to become more permeable. So you actually take in more stuff, and it's a little bit leaky. Now your immune system that lives outside your intestines can now attack the bacteria living inside the intestines, leaching these toxic chemicals that live inside the bacteria that causes a systemic inflammation. So now every organ system is going to get hit. And when you have enough insulin resistance dysbiosis, you get fat in your muscles, fat in your liver, fat in your pancreas. So organ systems stop working. And it turns out that when we get into what we call the morbid obesity category, we're actually getting inflammation in the brain as well. And that inflammation means that even our normal hormones that should govern our weight are not being responded to appropriately. And so that seems to be one of the central mechanisms by which this is happening. And this is just a schematic, which I think is probably beyond the scope of what we want to talk about. But you'll see the blue stuff is when everything's working well. So we have happy hormones. It's called psychobiotics, and good gut hormone release, and an appropriate kind of diffusion of materials in and out of the intestine. Whereas when we're eating when we're not treating our gut microbes well, we get all sorts of stress hormone release, and that gut becomes leaky, and your bacteria are now getting attacked, and we have all this inflammation. So what are the things that determine our gut microbes to see if they're healthy or not? So medications, antibiotics can screw up our gut microbes, in particular. Anything that's going to affect acid. So medications that reduce stomach acid might make a difference as well. Sleep disruption. So interesting studies showed that if you take people with obesity and you take their gut microbes and you put it into a mouse, the mouse will develop obesity. If you take someone lean, the mouse will remain lean. But if you take someone who's lean and they're jet lagged or sleep deprived, the mouse gets obesity with that same lean person's bacteria. So we know almost immediate effects of sleep disruption and jet lag on how our gut microbes function, predisposing us to obesity. Stress is another one. Inactivity seems to disrupt our gut microbes. High-fat diets, as I mentioned. Artificial sweeteners, they're purported to have no calories, but they actually cause the release of insulin and disrupt how our gut microbes function. And then organophosphates, which are pesticides. And it turns out that most of our pesticides are not eaten because we're eating non-organic broccoli. It's because the huge amount of single crop farms like soy and corn farms that are feeding livestock are littered with this stuff. So it gets into your food chain, even if you're eating beef and with organic broccoli. All right. So on a nice note, let's talk about circadian rhythm disruptions. So circadian, the term comes from circadian, which means about a day. This is basically an internal timekeeping mechanism that lasts. It turns out it's actually 24 hours and 15 minutes. You think like the clock changes every day based on sunlight, and it gives us a little bit of wiggle room. But the original Zeitgeber, it's just a word that I love. It's German, meaning time giver, I believe. And so it's an influence on our body's hormonal rhythms, right? So light is the original, the most important one, right? So when we're exposed to light, we produce a chemical called melanopsin, which blocks our melatonin production, which is the big sleep hormone. And so light exposure will keep us awake. And then as it gets darker, we have a drive to sleep. And when it's fully dark, we're producing melatonin, and we sleep. And then when it's light again, we wake up. And this system affects other things. So our thyroid hormone, we produce uh, like these steroids that give us energy, and cortisol that wake us up and give us energy. We produce a whole bunch of other hormones. And so the idea is that in the morning, we have lots of energy. We wake up, and we turns out that our digestive enzymes and our digestive system seems to have the same type of rhythm. So under ideal circumstances, we're producing a lot of insulin early in the morning, and we're sensitive to its action. Right. So if you think about it all, we're really designed to wake up when it's light out, go search for food, have lots of energy, eat the food, absorb it, and we're fine. As the day goes on, do less and less of that. Unfortunately, our system is such that we have this dysregulation. So we have electricity, we have an indoor life where we don't have to rely on the sun. We have 24-hour access to blue light on our cell phones and on our tablets and on our computers and on our TVs. And this seems to expose us to the same light that the sun would, and it disrupts our circadian rhythm. In fact, the population of employees that have the highest rates of obesity by far are people who are night shift workers, because they have this disruption and their normal daytime eating schedules are all thrown off. It turns out that actually Zeitgeber number 2 is food. So they've done studies where they can knock out the ability to produce all these chemicals in the brain and in mice that so don't respond to light, and yet you can retrain your body with food. So when we eat, and what we eat seems to affect us as well. So eating frequent snacks, eating high-fat foods, and eating late disrupt these rhythms so that our bodies don't function normally. And the problem with that is, when we have this disrupted rhythm, this is just an example of disrupting melatonin, but we normally have overnight, we're very resistant to the action of insulin, but we're very sensitive to its action in the daytime, right? Remember I said this insulin resistance is one of the key requirements for obesity. So we want insulin to function normally. If you block melatonin, you block the normal sleep cycle, you actually block our ability to use insulin appropriately. So everything goes wrong. Our digestive enzymes, our hunger drives, our fat storage, and then our use of insulin all get reversed. So we end up storing way excess fat. And fixing those rhythms seems to work. And so basically what we generally recommend for our patients is, try to minimize light exposure at night. Try to make sure you're eating earlier in the day, and try to make sure you're getting good quality sleep. And that's the kind of basis behind which we incorporate that into our dialogue with patients. So talking about what we can do about these situations, right? So for issue number 1, insulin resistance, how do we manage that? Well, so from a food standpoint, avoid saturated fat, number 1, right? And saturated fat, as I said, comes in the form of animal fat. It can be lots of added fat. Even benign fats that you might hear about, like olive oil, are not so benign. 15% of the fat in olive oil is saturated. So it's not as bad as, say, butter, but it's not perfect. And then there are some plant-based fats that seem to be particularly bad. Palm oil, found in junk food, and coconut oil, labeled as a health food, but actually quite harmful for you, are all saturated and will induce insulin resistance in most people. Avoid sugar, right? We talked about the effect of sugar on insulin resistance in the liver. It's also addictive, right? So we want to make sure. And then if you have insulin resistance, we by all means don't want to raise our blood sugars. Avoid excess animal protein consumption. I didn't really discuss this, but it turns out excess animal protein consumption seems also to be associated with insulin resistance. Part of it probably being linked to the saturated fat consumption, but it also throws us off metabolically. Artificial sweeteners I mentioned as well. Consume a diet high in fiber and antioxidants, right? We're now starting to reverse the process. And consume the majority of starches earlier in the day. That's going to respect our circadian rhythm and when our insulin is really present. Get about somewhere between 6 and 8.5 hours of quality sleep each night. It might vary from person to person, but as a general population, the sweet spot seems to lie somewhere in there. More than 8.5 hours sleep overall in the general population actually is associated with some issues as well, and less than 6 is associated with significant insulin resistance and generally overconsumption the next day. Get regular exercise, and when you can, up the intensity. The more intensity we have and the more volume of exercise we have, the more likely we are to get efficient uptake of the glucose into our muscle cells, which will undo some of this insulin inefficiency. For people who are really bad off or have certain conditions, or on certain medications that cause insulin resistance. Sometimes we use medications that help. Those typically are medications for people with diabetes, but they work well for people with prediabetes and obesity as well. But that's not for everyone. And then beyond the purview of this discussion, but intermittent fasting, and maybe people have questions about that. In certain people seem to actually improve insulin sensitivity, and that's something worth considering, but should be well thought out before engaging in it. All right, so how do we improve gut microbe function and simultaneously reduce inflammation and this kind of oxidative stress? So one is consume a prebiotic-rich diet, right? We talked about the foods associated with that, right? High fiber, high resistant starch like beans, fruits, vegetables, whole intact grains, nuts and seeds. That's going to have most of your prebiotics. Consume a whole foods based diet that limits animal proteins and excess fat. Get regular physical activity and exercise. Engage in regular stress management. Remember, getting stressed alone throws off your gut microbes, which then throws off your whole digestive and endocrine systems. Again, get that good quality sleep. Avoid artificial sweeteners and avoid what we call environmental obesogens. So I didn't mention all of them, but the antibiotics and the pesticides found in your food are some of them. There are other things like BPA, which are found in certain types of plastics. They're in fewer items than they used to be, but even they're often lining tuna fish cans, and they line the tubing of pumps used to get milk, even from organically produced milk from cows. So if you're eating dairy, you're eating things that drive obesity. All right, now establish appropriate circadian rhythm is the last kind of group of suggestions I want to talk about. So one thing is it's a rhythm, right? So we want to try to go to sleep the same time every day, wake up the same time every day. Avoid blue light exposure several hours prior to your scheduled sleep initiation. So we have most smartphones have a blue light filter. If not, you can get an app that will block the blue light. It'll turn things a little bit more kind of yellow orange, but it beats sleep deprivation. You can buy glasses. These are not glasses, but I have a pair of glasses that look like this that have a little bit kind of like yellow orange lenses, and that helps block it. So even if you are watching TV or doing something, it'll help. But don't wear them all day because excess blue light blocking during the day is associated with depression, right? Think what the rhythm is. During the day we want blue light, at night we don't. Front load your calorie consumption. So multiple studies have shown that people that eat more early in the day rather than late are more likely to lose weight. People who consume breakfast are more likely to manage their weight and have improved use of insulin. Studies that showed people that eat 1,800 calories for breakfast tend to lose weight, and nothing else for the rest of the day. If they have 1,800 calories for dinner, those same people will gain weight. Avoid snacking. So it turns out that our gut microbes and our brain likes to have maybe a few discrete meals. Actually, I've seen data that 2 meals is the best, but 2 or 3, but the biggest being early in the day. Avoid high-fat foods. We know that disrupts our rhythm. If you are someone who's sensitive to caffeine, limit caffeine consumption. If you're someone who can have a cup of coffee after dinner and still fall asleep and stay asleep, then this doesn't pertain to you. And consider intermittent fasting. Another potential benefit is its ability to reset our rhythms. So if you really twist my arm and you say, well, then how should I eat overall? How should I live overall? Generally, as a baseline of health, we recommend a whole food, plant-based diet, including prebiotic and antioxidant-rich foods. And if not that, then at least a plant-leaning diet where this is the baseline and the other stuff is only sometimes. At least moderate exercise in most days of the week. If you have the time, and if you don't, then try to make it a daily mindfulness practice or some form of stress management at the very least. Evidence points that mindfulness-based exercise really helps in this regard too, and it works on a different part of the brain that makes us more aware. Really try to coordinate your circadian rhythms, respect the addictive nature of our obesogenic environment, and don't think that we can just outwill ourselves. It doesn't seem to work. And then really, for those of us who have not experienced obesity, try to adopt this lifestyle before obesity sets in, because we'll spend the rest of our lives chasing our tail. So at Northwell Health, we have now, by August, we'll be up to 9 different sites throughout Northwell's very large system, ranging from Eastern Long Island, Central and Western Long Island, Queens, Manhattan, and Westchester. And we have obesity medicine specialists who see people one-on-one. We also have a comprehensive approach, which is we use multiple disciplines, which involve physicians and nurse practitioner and a psychologist and dietitians, and we try to involve groups as well. So the information's on the bottom. I think the slides will be findable if anyone's interested. And I'm ready for questions. Hopefully, I got done on time. 45 minutes. All right.
Perfect. You did amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Kane. That was amazing. It's such a multifactorial, complex issue. I think you did a fantastic job of, squeezing in some of the highlights into our limited amount of time here. And I definitely have some questions that I'd love for you to touch on. We
Sure.
actually have a couple questions about melatonin specifically. So I'll just pose them both to you. Basically, they're asking guidance for people who have trouble sleeping. Is taking a melatonin supplement, either short term or long term recommended? And then follow up to that, how does taking melatonin affect insulin?
Okay. So it's interesting. The last part of the question, maybe I'll take first and then go back. So the melatonin, interestingly, so things in the body never works in a straight line. So taking melatonin actually induces insulin resistance, and that sounds nuts, right? But remember, in the presence of melatonin, insulin works appropriately, and we are naturally resistant to insulin at night. So if and it looks like in animal models that as rodents age, just like as people age, they tend towards gaining bellies and losing belly fat and losing muscle. And when they put them on like just a very small but physiologic dose of melatonin, it actually induced more energy during, well, they're opposite than us, so during the night when they would be awake, and they lost belly fat and had more muscle. So it seemed to like, okay, well, the melatonin system functioning appropriately, even though melatonin causes insulin resistance, actually would cause a normal insulin response over the the course of the full day. Now, the problem is we don't know what the hell we're doing with humans yet, and it doesn't seem to work that simply. One, melatonin supplements are notoriously dishonest, and generally speaking, they either have none or excess. There is no real standardization how to do it. Number two, the doses are outrageous. So a physiologic dose of melatonin in humans is zero point 0.3 milligrams. So people should understand that. When they think more is better, it's not. In fact, mega doses of melatonin are used experimentally for advanced prostate cancer, and people stay awake for that, right? So taking more doesn't necessarily help. So if you're going to take melatonin, you take the lowest dose possible, zero point 0.3 or zero point 0.5 milligrams, and really try not to exceed that. But I can't necessarily recommend it. Once in a while with patients when we're out of other options, we do that, and you should take it probably a little before bedtime. I have not seen awesome results by use of melatonin. For a variety of reasons, it gives me concern. Although I think this is an awesome area for study, because I think particularly for people middle age and beyond who start having sleep related issues and also metabolic issues simultaneously, it seems to make sense. But we're not there yet.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for pointing out. I love that you said this idea of, these mega doses, right? I think very much in Western culture, we have this mindset of if something's good for me, then massive amounts of it must be good for me. And I think that moves beyond, of course, just the melatonin, vitamin supplements, fiber
Right.
supplements, things of this nature. And I love that you pointed out eating it is the important thing. And in that mindset, we do have a question about kind of the difference between insoluble and versus soluble fiber. Is that something that patients need to be concerned about when they're thinking about their complex carbs, whole
Eat it
grain?
all. You want both, right? So the insoluble stuff is going to be less in that prebiotic form. Some like celery is not particularly high in prebiotics, as I was talking about, but that doesn't mean it's not good for you, right? I mean, it's still bulk forming, and other microbes living kind of at the end of your intestines are gonna thrive off of that. So, but eat it all, right? So don't think you're just gonna eat celery and greens and get enough. That's where the legumes and to an extent, it depends on who it is, but to an extent the grains as well are going to have a lot more of the prebiotic forms of the soluble fiber.
Absolutely. Perfect. Thank you. And I really love that you touched on the idea of the gut bacteria. I think that's kind of a newer thing, definitely in cardiology that we're trying to discuss with our patients, and this idea of inflammation and the idea that kind of historically considered healthy animal products, if you will, low fat dairy, chicken, as you pointed out, these things can still, of course, have saturated fat. They do, but also promote these inflammatory processes in our body. And I think that on the same vein, seafood is a question I get a lot. So patients want to know, okay, so salmon's good for me, but what about shellfish? So I'd love for you to kind of touch on your recommendations for seafood for people.
Okay. So this is getting a little beyond just plain obesity, right? But some of the rationale for seafood would be the types of fatty acids in there. Also, there are multiple pathways by which animal protein is associated with cellular aging. And so, when cells age, we age, right? Our bodies will act, older organs won't function as well, and so forth. It turns out that seafood and fish don't have that damage necessarily coming from the protein, although it might be a little rough on the kidneys. Unfortunately, though, the fish is not what it would have been, say, 500 years ago. And so environmental pollutants and, in just for freshwater stuff is going to cause, meaning fresh caught, are loaded with obesogens. Some of them from stuff leached in the water from shipping industry and fishing industry, and also from just garbage, right, that's in there, and other chemical runoffs that get in there. And unfortunately, those are obesogens. So it's hard to say eat a lot. And then if you look at larger studies, so the Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda, California, where there's a genetically diverse group, large number of people being studied, where the baseline religion is one of veganism, adding fish doubles the rates of obesity and diabetes, right? So, like, is fish a health food in that regard? Probably not. It's probably better for you than the meat alternative. And that. So what we don't know is, where's the threshold? Is it 1 day a week that makes a difference? Is it 2 days a week? Is it none at all? We're not sure. And kind of apropos of our conversation about low amounts of stuff still being potent, it seems that some of these environmental obesogens, these chemicals that get in the water supply, even in very, very small amounts, seem to have an effect on our endocrine system and obesity. So, maybe that's the reason behind it, and not anything else. On the seafood front, it's the only difference is that seafood's high in dietary cholesterol, and that's less associated with raising your blood lipids than we call cholesterol, but can get converted into a potent estrogen. So when you're thinking about kind of some other hormonal effects, then I would say keep that to a minimum. But again, when I give a gradation of protein quality, I start with legumes as number one, and then I use fish and seafood as the next level, and then I say try never to go beyond that. So.
That's perfect. Thank you. We do have another question about some of the best approaches to counteract if someone is dealing with either metabolic syndrome already or PCOS.
Right. So the metabolic hallmark of metabolic syndrome and PCOS is insulin resistance. These are intimately connected. It turns out for PCOS, that patients with PCOS have insulin resistance, but it's just like an amplified version of people without PCOS. So the same stuff that causes insulin resistance causes it in them. So what we do for our patients with insulin resistance is we put them on a plant-leaning, high fiber, high antioxidant diet. We get lots of exercise in there when they can. Unfortunately, our better success is usually when they're on some form of medication that helps with the insulin sensitivity as well. And so, but that doesn't mean that like if you don't want to take medication that you shouldn't be doing the other stuff anyway. But that's generally how it works. Metabolic syndrome we've probably look at in a very similar fashion, right? Metabolic syndrome is not just a collection of numbers; it's associated with, for instance, a woman with diabetes and metabolic syndrome has a 9-fold risk of heart attack than someone without that stuff. 9-fold. So our goal is to make all that stuff go away, and that's really focusing on the same stuff that we talked about, right? The the diet and the exercise. Now, if you have PCOS and if you have metabolic syndrome and it's really bad, the amount of kind of the starches that you eat might have to be played with a little bit, and that's really person to person. As a general rule of thumb, you can eat starches and still reverse insulin resistance, but for some people, it really makes it hard, depending on how much you're exercising, who they are, how much starch. So we would tend to at least give some cutoffs on how much people take for that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think you really, driven home and illuminated that it is so much more complex than just calories in, calories out, and we did have a question that's asking about genetic testing and asking if there's any validity in that, if genetic tests would identify a best diet for people or things that they should focus on based on any of their genetic testing.
Uh, we don't do that right now.
Mhm.
I think that it might ultimately be helpful long term. Right? We can, what we talk about is for all comers. So we look at all comers with PCOS, look at all comers with a risk of coronary disease, or all comers with diabetes, and there probably are some genetic modifications. We know, for instance, with saturated fat, that not everyone who consumes saturated fat has morbid obesity, right? Some people do, even with small amounts. And so there are known genetic mutations that affect the ability to process the saturated fat. So it's more dangerous for cardiac event risk and more dangerous for obesity and diabetes for those people than everyone else. But as a general population, it's not a useful food for anyone. So I think we're not quite there yet, but hopefully soon.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, I know we're getting close to time, so I will honor everyone's time. But final question, we do get a lot of questions about sort of these more fad diets, if you will, the keto diet, the paleo style of eating, things of that nature. And I think that a lot of times people are very concerned about the types of food, but I'd love for you just briefly, as much as you could, touch on the intermittent fasting. We have patients concerned about entering into starvation mode, if you will, and that it's important to be eating every 2 to 3 hours to keep your metabolism firing. I'd love for you to just kind of touch on that mindset, in regard to, is the fasting beneficial, for who, that type
Right.
of thing.
Okay, so let's just set the record straight on like metabolism firing. Yes, eating has something called the thermogenic effect of food. When you eat, you burn calories. Guess what? As the day goes on, the thermic effect of food goes down, so that you're barely getting anything out of your late eating. So let's kind of scrap that as useful, but you are taking in way more calories. Also, if you burn an extra 11 or 15 calories with a 200-calorie snack, how's that helping yourself? Right? So, and we know from studies that you're disrupting your circadian function and your gut microbes when you're overeating like that. So generally speaking, we've moved away from people snacking unless they have certain conditions or they're athletes trying to bulk up, but that's not why we're here to discuss bulking up. So intermittent fasting is interesting, right? So the notion is that a couple of things. One is that small stressors in controlled fashion for the body seem to have compensatory responses that are good for us. Exercise actually causes oxidative stress, but we have a compensatory antioxidant response that actually improves insulin resistance. So we want to cause that stress. Like going into a sauna actually is showed to improve deep sleep, right? It's the stress on the body, but it's the compensatory response that improves our deep sleep the next time we sleep. Okay, so there are things like that. Same thing seems to happen. So there's some compensations that happen in the setting of intermittent fasting that seem to be happy for your body. It looks like insulin resistance improves with intermittent fasting, but intermittent fasting we can define as a constellation of different techniques. So there are, what most people now think of intermittent fasting is what we call time restricted eating, which is that you pick a certain number of hours during the day during which you eat, and then you have a long period during which you don't eat. We know that if your eating window is more than 12 hours, let's say you eat breakfast at 7 a.m. and you keep eating until 8 or 9 p.m. at night, then those people are more likely to have metabolic dysfunction. So as a rule of thumb for patients, we say even if you're not engaging in intermittent fasting, you make them do it anyway by saying don't eat more than 12 hours for a window. There's more profound weight loss with a 10-hour window, 8-hour window, or even a 6-hour window. And so being able to keep that every day, your body will reset a rhythm and be able to manage doing that. Each night, if things go well, your body goes into ketosis. Now, we're not recommending a ketogenic diet as being good for you because a ketogenic diet is one, it's constant, and two, it's filled with toxic animal proteins and particularly lots of saturated fat that we know is bad for us, and it's very low in carbohydrates that is also associated with increased mortality. So we don't want to do that. But if you can create via fasting a small amount of ketosis each night, it seems to have beneficial effects, we think. So that might be one. There are other types of intermittent fasting where people might do periodic fasting. So they might do, an every other day fast, or 2 days of the week they'll fast, or they might do a modified fast where they eat 400 or 600 calories for their fasting day, and then the rest of the days not eat. Some people do long-term, like water fasts. I do not do a water fast without medical supervision, and even with medical supervision, really think about it. There's some interesting studies as to what happens, but when you do prolonged fasting and you eat, it is potentially lethal when you refeed. So be very careful. More lethal than the fasting itself is. So we have to be very careful with that. Of note, the intermittent, the alternate day fasting where you eat one day, don't eat the next, eat the next day, was associated with elevated cholesterol. So we generally recommend against that one in particular until we see better evidence. The easiest one, the one that patients tend to stick to the most are the day-to-day time-restricted eating. And so that's probably your best bet. Now, one last piece on that. A lot of patients skip breakfast and eat at night. Our heaviest patients do that by baseline. So in and of itself is not a weight loss tool. It looks like that the data suggests that our metabolism and things work better when we eat in the morning. So if you're gonna do, let's say, an 8-hour fast, you're best off eating breakfast and being done eating within 8 hours of that. Also, it's debatable whether pure fasting alone fixes everything. And if you could do the fasting while eating healthy food, you might double your efforts.
Absolutely. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. I mean, I could talk about this all night, and I know we all could. It was so fascinating, really. Thank you so much, Dr. Kane.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
I think you did an amazing job of packing so much pertinent information into our short window here. So thank you so much. And to our audience, I hope I answered as many or posed as many questions to Dr. Kane as I could. And for information on our future talks, our future lectures, please feel free to contact Alexandra. Her email is in the chat function. We do know that our talk next week is going to be by Dr. Yang. He is one of our interventional cardiologists. And I believe the panel is going to be conducted in all Chinese. So we're really trying to have more outreach. We had a Spanish lecture. So we're really trying to, reach all different types of the community. So please do reach out to Alexander if you'd like further information. Most likely the next panel will be at the end of June. We're just waiting for Dr. Yang to be able to get everything set up for us. So please join us for that. And don't forget YouTube, Doc Heart Health, which is also listed in our chat. We'll have all of the previous recordings and tonight. So tell all your friends, send them here to see the amazing information that Dr. Kane gave us this evening. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Kane. This was really fantastic.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
All right. Thank you all so much. Hopefully we'll see you next month. Good night, everybody.